All right, guys, this is it. You are almost done. Ecology and ecosystems is the last new information you will learn this school year. After this lesson, we start reviewing, and we will spend the rest of the year reviewing for our EOC and then doing some fun projects there at the end. So power it out. You just got a little bit left, and we're going to finish up with the broadest spectrum of biology. You see, we started this year at the smallest molecules of life, water. Which are some of the smallest molecules in the human body. And then we ended where how all biology is working together. So we've worked up in scale, going from molecules like water and macromolecules up to cells, and then we started talking about organisms and interactions of cells and our DNA and how DNA works. Then we started talking about evolution, body systems, and now we are at ecology and ecosystems. So you have a vocabulary sheet there with you. You'll want to follow along with this PowerPoint. So the first thing that we have to do when we're studying ecosystems is we want to look at biotic versus abiotic. So a lot of this is going to be review of what you learned or should have learned last year. Abiotic means non-living. You see bio here means life, and A means not life. And biotic, of course, means life. So the examples of abiotic things are going to be things like water, rocks, temperature, humidity. These things are not alive. Whereas things that are alive in an ecosystem are like animals, plants, the microorganisms, so like things in the soil, bacteria, anything that does cell respiration, basically. So anything that has or does cell respiration, has a mitochondria, is consuming food or making its own food in some way. So anything that is alive versus anything that's not alive. These two things work together to form the ecosystem. So abiotic versus biotic is the number one foundation for what you need. All right, so when we start talking about nutrients versus energy in an ecosystem, we have two different things. Nutrients are going to cycle through an ecosystem. So you guys have heard of the water cycle, of course, where water rains down, it goes into trees, it comes out of plants by transpiration, it goes into the water percolation, it evaporates, it condensates, and it goes back in. So you have your water cycle here. Also things like carbon dioxide cycle. So the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes into plants. It comes out of factories. It also comes out of cell respiration. It goes into the soil. So you have a cycle of carbon dioxide. Basically meaning water is not destroyed in an ecosystem. It's just transferred to the next stage. Carbon dioxide is not destroyed. It's just transferred to the next stage. And so we're cycling these things through. And these are going to be nutrients or abiotic things that are going to cycle here. So abiotic factors are going to cycle through an ecosystem. Now, this is different than energy. So energy, and this refers to biotic energy or living energy, is going to transfer. It does not cycle. It's a one-way street, right? So energy is transferred starting at our producer. So energy gets into the ecosystem by light, and it gets into the biotic life through photosynthesis. So that's why it goes into your producers, which are going to be your plants, anything that does photosynthesis. Primary consumers, which are herbivores and omnivores, are going to eat the plants. So the energy is going to transfer from the plants to your primary consumers. The secondary consumers are then going to eat the primary consumers, which means the energy transfers again. And then it goes on to tertiary, quaternary. They go all the way up through the different types of consumers in an ecosystem. So all of this energy is used by the animals. So for instance, if you eat food, you're using that energy to digest that food. You're using that energy to write these notes down. You're using that energy to walk from class to class. You're using that energy to talk to your friends, to text on your phone. We use it in our day-to-day lives. But we also lose some of that energy. So some of the energy is lost as heat. And when I say some, I mean 90% is actually released as heat. Only 10% of the energy is stored. So we're using this energy through cell respiration. And during cell respiration, we store some of that energy to be broken down later. We store that in our lipid molecules or our fat molecules. The other 90% is lost as heat. And that's why, in the video games or in movies, you'll see where you'll put on the infrared goggles and you can start seeing like the outline of people, even in, like through a wall or something like that. And you can see their heat signatures. That's because all living things put out heat. And it's because of this, 90% of it's released as heat. The rest of the energy travels up. So producers contain the most energy in an ecosystem, secondary consumers less energy, so on and so forth. Finally, any energy that's left over is going to our decomposers. Our decomposers are what break down dead things. So the mushrooms, the bacteria, like the fungi, the bacteria, little invertebrates like maggots and flies that break down dead things, those are decomposers. Those actually absorb the rest of the energy and release the last little bit as heat. So no energy is coming back around. No energy goes back to the sun. It's a one-way street. It goes from the sun, which I'll draw down here. It goes from the sun here, and then it goes all the way down into the microbial life. It does not cycle back to the sun. All right, biomass is a term you might hear. Biomass is the total energy stored at one trophic level. Basically, if you have one blade of grass versus one cow, those things have a different mass. You don't have a blade of grass that weighs as much as a cow. So you're going to need thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of blades of grass to equal one cow. This is biomass. So if the most biomass is here in the primary producers, and so on and so forth. That's why an entire forest might only be able to contain one or two top predators. We'll go over this more in review because this is going to be important for you to know about your biomass period or pyramid and the energy pyramid. So please rewatch the slide if you need to. Also watch the Movie Sisters videos, things like that to help out with that as well. Food webs, again, something you really should have probably learned in middle school. This is basically a food chain, except it's a map. So instead of being just a chain from one to the next, it shows how energy actually transfers. So you're going to have lots of arrows instead of just one chain. All right, so here's another slide on energy transfer. We can see the light energy or chemical energy, if you're under the ocean, is traveling up the pyramid, and we are losing energy. We have the most energy, less energy, and so on. Same thing with biomass. We have the most biomass at the bottom. So it could be, let's just say it's 50 plants can only sustain 5 crickets, which only can sustain 3 birds, which means 2 snakes, which means 1 hawk or owl. Moving up from there, in order to have this owl be healthy, all of this has to be correct in the ecosystem. When it is not correct, like let's say we take out our snake population, all of a sudden this hawk population is also going to die because they lost their food source. Here's a better picture of that food web here. You can see how the energy is transferring. The arrows are going from the producers into what eats those producers. So sometimes one butterfly will eat 2 different producers. All right, population size. Population size is important when we're looking at ecosystems because it helps us see what the health of a and there's several things that go into population size. First of all, a population is a group of interbreeding individuals, which means like you might have a wolf population here in America. You have another wolf population in Eastern Europe. Those 2 wolf populations are completely different because they are not breeding with each other. Last I checked, a wolf can't go and get a ticket on a boat and come over to America just to find a lady wolf. They're 2 different populations because they are not interbreeding. So factors that affect a population size is going to be your birth and your death rates. How many individuals are being born versus how many individuals are dying. So we call this natality and mortality, right? So individuals that are born increase the population, individuals that die decrease the population. You also have immigration and emigration. Immigration is people moving into the population permanently. Emigration is people moving out of the population permanently. If people are moving in and out of the population, for instance, people who just live down here in South Florida only for the winter and then they move back north for the summer, that's migration, right? Or birds coming south for the summer or for the winter. That's migration. So they're migrating here and then migrating back. But permanent movement, so immigration is permanent movement into a new population. Emigration is permanent movement out of a population. So these things are going to affect the population size. You have a lot of individuals being born and not many dying, your population is going to grow because more people are being born than are dying. That's what's happening to the human population now. Human population has babies that are being born at a pretty consistent rate, but people are living longer and longer and longer because of advances in modern medicine. Also, more babies are surviving because of modern medicine. So we are increasing our birth rate and we're decreasing our mortality rate, which means that our population is growing. If there was something that happened, let's say like a zombie apocalypse came through and all of a sudden a bunch of people started dying and the population goes down to almost zero, that's because more people are dying and less people are being born. All right, so population size. We have something called carrying capacity. This is the maximum number of individuals in a population that an ecosystem can support. So if you look at this graph, this blue line here is the carrying capacity. This population can, or this ecosystem can only support 1.5 million individuals in this species, right? So what normally happens in the wild is that species will get more than 1.5 million. And then because the ecosystem can no longer support that many individuals, and this is because of limiting factors. Limiting factors are things that limit population growth, just like it sounds. So things like the climate, it's just too hot for enough plants to grow. The amount of food, if there's fire, the amount of water, right? There's certain things that the population is just gets overpopulated. And so some of those individuals end up dying. And then they end up dying. And then once they've gone under carrying capacity, they're like, oh, there's a little bit more room, more individuals start to be born. So the population kind of follows this, doesn't follow the carrying capacity exactly. Now, of course, animals aren't out there counting their numbers and doing a census. This happens naturally. This is also where natural selection comes into play. Because when a population is overpopulated, the individuals that are going to die are most likely going to be the weaker individuals. And so you start to have the individuals with mutations that are favorable surviving, and then they become more prevalent in the population. So limiting factors and carrying capacity work very well together, and this keeps populations in check. All right, now let's talk about how ecosystems are made. So in Hawaii, there are new islands that are forming all the time. And these islands are forming from volcanoes. So a volcano will come out of the ocean and it will deposit rock and lava at the top of the ocean surface. So this volcano has been erupting underneath the ocean surface for millions of years, and the rock layers are just getting deposited on top of the mountain. So you just get more and more rock layers until eventually those rock layers break through the surface of the ocean. And now you have an island. So those rock layers have no life on them at all. They are only bare rock. So the first thing that comes in is a pioneer species, and a pioneer species are going to colonize this rock. This is called primary succession because this is how an ecosystem is formed for the very first time, right? So the first things that are going to come in are normally like mosses and things like that, lichens, mosses, fungi, and these are going to live and then they're going to die. And when they die, they decompose into microorganisms, which is eventually going to form soil. This soil then allows certain plants to take root, which then allows larger plants to take root. Now you start to have things, and so all these are considered pioneer species. And then you start to have, when you start to have plants, you start to have things like birds and other either swimming or flying species can get to this island and can start pollinating those plants. They might lay some eggs, and then now you start to have some animals, and those birds and insects and other things, or just the waves might wash up different types of plant seeds. So now instead of having just one or two types of plants, you have many types of plants. And eventually you'll have a climax community. Now, as things are dying, they're adding to the soil layer, so you're getting deeper and deeper soil. This process takes thousands of years. Thousands of years. This is not a process that just can take place over a few days. And it could take hundreds of years if you had a very rich environment. Scientists are really lucky right now. The island popped up in Hawaii, I think it was a couple decades ago, that scientists knew that they would get to study this process for the first time, and unaltered. So they have cameras and all kinds of tests that they're doing. They're not influencing the ecosystem. They're just observing how an ecosystem is actually built. We also have something called secondary succession. And this is when an ecosystem had formed, but then it got destroyed. So there was a destructive event. For instance, a forest fire or a flood, or it was torn down and a Walmart got built, and then that Walmart got destroyed again, and now the ecosystem was allowed to regrow. So you had your ecosystem and it was all set and ready to go. Fire burned it down to nothing but soil. Well, now you can have plants come in almost immediately because you already had the soil. You didn't have to go through that whole process of it breaking down and reforming the soil again. And now the plants can start growing, animals can start coming in. A lot of these plants that burned might have had seeds under the ground already. They can come in a lot faster. This only takes maybe a decade or two. It only takes, 5, 10, maybe 15 years to regrow to its original spot. So this is much faster. And this is what we see in most of the world now. Primary succession happened all over the world millions and millions of years ago, billions of years ago. But now that our ecosystems are mostly established, except for like a new island, we're going to see secondary succession. So right now, Australia, which just got destroyed by a lot of the fires recently, there's areas in Australia that are going through this process, that are at this area number 4 right here. And the ecosystem will rebuild. And humans can actually help this positively by going out and planting trees and taking away harmful things from the ecosystem to let them grow faster. All right. Now, one of the last things we're going to talk about is an invasive species. Invasive species are non-native, which means they are introduced to a population, and they become overpopulated because they breed quickly, they have no natural predators, and they're successful in their new environment. An example of this right now that we're dealing with are the pythons in the Everglades. So people would get these big snakes as pets, and then they realize that they're hard to take care of, and you don't want to have to buy live rats and mice to feed them all the time, and they grow out of their tank, and they escape and scare people. So they said, you know what, I'm just going to release it. I don't want to kill it. I don't want to put it in a pet store. I'm just going to release it into the wild. Well, when they did that, more than 1 or 2 people were doing this, and eventually the snakes started breeding. Well, these snakes are huge, and they have no natural predators in the Everglades. They can easily evade an alligator, and actually they've been known to win a fight with an alligator. They are consuming a lot of the prey that normally only was consumed by alligators and other large fish and reptiles in the Everglades, and they are becoming invasive, meaning they're outcompeting other species, and they're having negative effects on the native species of the Everglades. So it's introducing another predator, and the ecosystem can't support another predator, so it's destroying the ecosystem. So that's an example of an invasive species. There are some other examples like mussels, the shellfish that are in the water, so you can order mussels or clams, they're similar to clams. But mussels will go into certain lakes and rivers, and their populations just explode and they take over. There's a few other examples that you can go over for your create an ecosystem project. You'll need to create an invasive species. Humans can be considered an invasive species. We've gone into a lot of areas that we're not naturally inclined to be in. and built cities and outcompeted a bunch of other species. So, but invasive species breed quickly, have no natural predators, and are successful in their new environment. Right, last thing, speaking of humans, human impacts. We interact by our environment. We remove and add species. We construct new buildings. We pollute things. We often cause permanent changes in the ecosystem. And one thing, and I know this is a question on your test here, a lot of times we have unintended consequences. We can think we're doing something good, like releasing the snake instead of killing it. But that causes a consequence that we did not intend to happen. Or we could do something like, oh, we're going to go plant this new type of tree. One example in Mississippi is that they part of the land was eroding and it was eroding too fast. So they went and planted these vines. Well, they didn't really research what type of vines they were planting, and they planted something called kudzu, and it took over everything. I mean, it killed all the trees. It was a vine that grew over the trees, and it grew over all the trees. It killed the trees. Then the erosion actually got worse. So a lot of times the best thing for humans to do is just not to mess with our environment at all. The only way we should be messing with our environments is by cleaning up the destruction that we've already done, like cleaning up the trash off a beach. That's a great thing that humans can do, because we put the trash there to begin with, which was not such a great thing. We do not want to go be interacting with the environment in a way that's not researched, because our consequences can be bad even if we're meaning good. So, but human impacts to interact with the environment. Remember, removing and adding species, construction, and pollution are some of the big ones. So that's the ecology lesson. You did it. You learned everything you need to know for this year, and I'm sure you remember every bit of it. Which, because I know you don't, that's okay. We'll be spending the rest of the year reviewing this information for your EOC. So just try to keep all your paperwork as I pass it back, because you can use that. But even if you don't, you'll have some other packets and other review things that we'll be going through. We're going to be playing lots of review games, and I'll be seeing you guys soon. Have a great day.